Welcome to my brief presentation of my master's dissertation in International Animal Welfare, Ethics, Policy, and Law, where I examine the drivers of U.S. corporate farm animal welfare policy. In spite of what has been very slow progress, I believe that CSR efforts hold the greatest potential for sustained, meaningful improvements in the welfare of farmed animals. However, there's little published research helping to explain the organization, function, and limitations of the supply chain challenged to translate consumer expectations into animal welfare reality. Until this gap is addressed, the ability to drive meaningful change and improvements in the welfare of farm animals in the U.S. will no doubt be minimal. And that was the inspiration for my research question. The aim of this study was to understand the historic and future drivers of animal welfare-focused CSR policy within the U.S., and if possible, identify barriers to that policy execution. To answer this question, I needed to talk to leaders in the food space, hoping to understand how they viewed animal welfare, what informed that view, had their views been translated into animal welfare policy, and most importantly, had their policies demonstrated any meaningful improvement in the welfare of farmed animals. I conducted interviews with 12 employees representing 9 U.S. companies. Before each interview, I researched the company's public websites to review them, making note of stated policies or demonstrated efforts specific to animal welfare. I had a list of general topic questions that were developed to address 4 specific research question themes that I identified at the outset. Those were historic drivers, future drivers, formulating policy, and barriers to execution. Of the 12 participants interviewed, tenure with their current employer ranged from less than 1 year up to 38 years. 4 participants representing 3 companies held positions under quality and food safety. 7 representing 5 companies held positions within sustainable or ethical sourcing, and 1 held a position under general business categories. Each had at least 1 college degree, and 4 had completed a master's degree. The majority of those were in sustainability. Thematic analysis identified 8 major themes across the 4 research questions. The major theme of the historic drivers was reactive. The theme of future drivers was strategic. The theme of formulating policy was a balancing act. And 5 themes emerged for barriers, and that included the business case, competing priorities, support, influence, and authority. Nearly half of all the coded text focused on barriers in the execution of policy. This was an area where we all seemed to commiserate during the interviews. Within each theme, primary, secondary, and tertiary subthemes were identified. The results presented here are really focused on the themes and subthemes that represented a greater portion of each discussion topic. When asked to discuss the historical drivers of animal welfare policy, the discussion was often briefed and coded into one theme, reactive. Within this theme, 3 subthemes were identified: risk management, peer pressure, and activist pressure. Comments specific to activist pressure are captured best by the following quote: "I would say probably some of the examples of some of the more public commitments that we've made within the realm of animal welfare, like cage-free egg commitment, the gestation crate, those were things that were made not part of a strategic roadmap, but something that maybe, was a little bit more reactive." Interviewees also indicated that their animal welfare policies were created as a risk mitigation strategy against shareholder proposals or because of peer pressure after other companies had been pressured or because positive business results had been seen when companies made similar commitments. Several participants commented that they felt reactive decisions were not the best thing for animal welfare. One person had explained, "My personal feeling is that the cage-free train had already left the station. And unfortunately, studies like the Coalition for Sustainable Egg Supply showed that actually the enriched cage colony performed better across different criteria than cage-free. But unfortunately, so many companies had already made a commitment so that consumers were already familiar with cage-free, so it was kind of a sticky situation." It was also noted that pressure from activists had been essential to driving progress in some areas, with comments like, if it wasn't for those other videos, the farm program would still be Farm 1.0 and not Farm 3.0. Other comments like, if it wasn't for the Hallmark video in 2008, we'd still be dragging down cows. Another participant reflected on the negative impact reactive decision-making can have, saying, when you just sort of succumb to the pressure without thinking it through, it sends the wrong message that we'll just be whatever you say you want us to be to mitigate pressure, even if it's the wrong decision. Future drivers were summed into one major theme, strategic. These were broken down into sub-themes of the boardroom, connecting, brand reputation, and Me Too. A sub-theme of the boardroom included prioritize. Comments here focused on efforts represented over half the discussion specific to the boardroom. Prioritization was used in identifying issues that the company was going to direct specific energy and resources towards. This was best captured in the voice of one participant when asked to describe how they decided on where to focus their areas within sustainability. They explained that they'd been aligning and identifying internally where they wanted to lead. They identified some of the most and largest sustainability opportunities or risks, and those were the areas that they definitely were going to focus on. The connecting subtheme had a secondary subtheme of the commons. The commons represented 60% of the connecting discussion and was further divided into tertiary subthemes of shared values and shared interests. Comments regarding shared values are best represented by quotes such as doing the right thing, a phrase that was mentioned specifically in 6 of the 9 interviews. Additional comments include, how do we communicate that our product is within the ethical standards that our customers expect? The largest contributor to future drivers was brand reputation, also divided into secondary and tertiary subthemes. The largest thematic contributor to brand reputation subtheme was transparency, referenced in 8 of the 9 interviews and represented 56% of the discussion related to brand reputation and summarized best by the following quote, it's transparency. That's the number one next thing. Discussion of transparency frequently included both principles of sharing information about efforts being made at the farm level as well as transparency. It was evident that being able to show exactly where and how animals were being raised and the complete journey from farm to table was very important. One person explained, people gravitate towards packaging and efforts where traceability exists, but the amount of folks that actually follow through on checking the traceability or even scanning the code is limited. But the credibility you get by saying you're putting in the effort and showing the consumer that you are is unbelievable. The process of developing policy within companies was visualized under a single theme, balancing act. One of those subthemes was perspectives. There were numerous references to benchmarking and collaboration. The collaborative process was referred to by participants, often referencing working with experts, but always in the context of considering other perspectives, noting that priority is given to the customers always. One participant expressed frustration. These experts they referenced were not willing to consider other perspectives, saying that the scientists who work at prestigious universities, I think sometimes they see things as black and white. And I try to bring some of the stakeholder perspectives or the consumer concerns to the table. When they're thinking, oh, the consumer doesn't know what they're talking about, or oh, that activist group has their own agenda. This is a great example of where we look at the science and we align with what our customers are expecting as well. It was repeatedly acknowledged that science was only part of the equation, not the entire equation. Interviewees' discussions around opportunity were described in developing policy based on opportunities based on a given species. These opportunities may be the result of the amount of product purchased or because of a specific issue related to a species. It became very clear that the businesses were now trying to ensure that policies created meaningful improvement in the welfare of animals rather than simply making a statement or checking a box. This was represented by a comment by one interviewee saying, "We're trying to understand what we can do that matters. Instead of making good profits for certification organizations, I would rather spend the money directly on something that actually helps the farmer instead of helping a big certification multinational." The final subtheme, bottom line, was expected and was reflected in every interview as questions about cost, willingness to pay, and economics were discussed. The most complex discussions were around barriers to the execution of policy. These represented nearly half of the discussion throughout the interviews. There was often an overlap between discussion of barriers to execution and future drivers and the formation of policy, particularly when speaking about issues related to the business case. There were 5 distinct major themes that arose from these discussions: business case, support, authority, competing priorities, and influence. One subtheme of business case was quantifying value. The other was economic viability. Discussions specific to quantifying value related to either an inability to measure improvements in the outcomes in animal welfare or an inability to demonstrate an impact to either the animals or the business. Within economic viability, the largest secondary subtheme was value versus values. Discussions around value versus values included statements about how quality and food safety always trump animal welfare, and that a consumer's willingness to pay does not seem to translate at the cash register. Participants repeatedly referenced that consumers were not willing to share in the increased cost of demonstrated efforts in animal welfare. When it comes to food safety, the message was very clear. One said, "When you get right down to it, food safety is more important first. I mean, it's got to be wholesome and not kill anybody when they eat it." The support theme was represented by 4 subthemes: governance, voice of a champion, spread thin, and teamwork. Both governance and voice of a champion were fundamentally related to the organization of the business leadership. 7 of the 9 participants expressed frustration with or recommended changes in the corporate structure that they thought would be helpful. One participant explained that expertise was lacking across the organization and how isolation of the business unit impeded execution. They said there's not a lot of people who can talk about animal welfare and really understand it company-wide. They've got other things to worry about. So there's a lot of, well, I think we've got good, strong values at the core, and it's just better coordination of the thinking about these things and keeping it out of silos is where we really need to mature. Another participant described how important it was that leadership not only be invested in the goals, but that they share the enthusiasm and are listened to at the highest levels of the organization. Support subthemes, spread thin and teamwork, were a reflection of the immense scope that each of the persons interviewed felt was expected of them in terms of how to manage and what they were dependent on other parts of the organization to carry out policy. Every participant described how they were either solely responsible for or part of a small team responsible for multiple species or for multiple focus areas within sustainability, ethical sourcing, or food safety and quality. Interestingly, the companies with the best track record of demonstrated animal welfare improvements were those where animal welfare was located in the quality department. 2 subthemes represented authority: advisors, not buyers. Advisors, not buyers represented discussions highlighting the gap where participants set the policy, but purchasing agreements and procurement decisions were made by different business units that were often not aligned with or didn't understand their priority. This visibility represented the complexity of the supply chain and the fact that very few of the participants had the opportunity to audit at the farm level, and that challenge was represented by one person saying, "Visibility into the supply chain, I think, continues to be a challenge, as well to be able to understand what's really and actually happening in the supply chain." In competing priorities, this was mentioned in 6 of 9 participants. Competing priorities revealed how difficult it can be to manage animal welfare across the supply chain, across multiple species, and across a broad consumer base. This frustration was more evident with participants that had broader responsibilities across ethical sourcing, saying it's not that it's not something we care deeply about, it's that there's a lot of things we care deeply about with somewhat limited resources. So in summary, when it comes to animal welfare, it's clear that we are in a continual game of catch-up with science and consumer expectations. The dialogue provided by the participants provided a rich account of the challenges faced by these companies as they navigate the CSR landscape in the US. Handling animal welfare in the corporate space has certainly evolved in the face of continued challenges and a steep learning curve. Represented here as a steep climb, but admittedly best represented by a maze and a minefield. Regardless of company format, all agreed that initial drivers were reactive, clearly demonstrating that corporations have previously either ignored or dismissed the topic of farm animal welfare. This highlights the challenge faced by many US companies who are then forced to formulate animal welfare policy under pressure. This was most evident in the repeated references made by the participants of the study to challenges they faced when making policy decisions regarding cage-free eggs. It seems that buyer's remorse, or perhaps buy-in remorse, may finally be setting in. The numerous references made by the participants about corporate decisions ideally being science-based, but with a general exception that in the end, businesses are in the business of selling product to consumers and that the customer will be the ultimate arbiter of the expectations around animal welfare was very clear. Throughout the discussions, transparency, whether related to the need to connect to consumers or challenges in collecting and sharing information, emerged as both an opportunity and a potential threat for the supply chain. The need for companies to prioritize their efforts was clear. The challenges for companies 2 or 3 steps removed from the farm with multiple animal protein products in addition to other hot-button issues such as worker rights should not be underestimated. The balancing act of developing policy and competing priorities is a significant challenge, especially considering the role of the social media, where a post can effectively change the narrative overnight. Discussions of support, particularly governance, highlighted the need for leadership and an understanding of animal welfare and what meaningful efforts look like. Participants largely agree that there was often a lack of capacity regarding knowledge of animal welfare within their own organizations, and that success depended on whether or not their senior leadership was invested in the issue. This potential disconnect between different aspects within a particular company is worrisome, and it also places the company at an increased risk if they're called upon to show how they're providing leadership on animal welfare and arguably any other social issue. In conclusion, the participants interviewed in this study identified numerous challenges when developing and managing animal welfare in the CSR space. The experience of the supply chain professionals interviewed was inconsistent with economic theory suggesting consumers will afford the costs associated with delivering improvements in animal welfare when substantiated by labels and claims. It'll be critical to understand the complex and nuanced drivers of animal welfare policy in the corporate environment if meaningful improvement in animal welfare is going to be realized. Considering the reflections of the supply chain professionals, their focus on transparency, trust, and connecting with consumers, we suggest that the application of technologies that allow the development of transparent and traceable stories to be shared with a consumer may provide the means by which to deliver on the CSR animal welfare promise. Thank you.